There's a reason why we're all weirdos who make strange food. We're in a cartoon.
Cartoon?
Yes, just a silly cartoon.
So as of right now, I'm actually gearing up to record a video about a webcomic that I'm making, a fan comic that I'm making right now. And I realized as I was getting ready to record that, I realized that in a lot of ways I'm actually repeating history. So my webcomic is essentially putting a comedy character in an action setting, and a long time ago as a kid I had that same concept, but instead of with Disney characters I had it with Cartoon Network characters. So I guess as a kid I did a lot of drawing, I did a lot of coming up with ideas for comics and TV shows and stuff, but like a lot of them weren't really super original. Like a lot of times it was just me like taking some sort of like other TV show or something that I liked and trying to put my own spin on it or whatever, right? And I think the apex of that was a concept for a crossover Cartoon Network story that I had. I actually had one that kind of predates this one, that is kind of like an evolution of that. It was really just like, characters like kind of just hanging out, whatever. But like my other concept I had was like bizarrely elaborate, and I don't even want to say that this was even like a fan fiction or like a comic or whatever. I'm pretty sure it was kind of like a glorified like TV show pitch, right? And like I essentially wanted this thing to be pitched to Cartoon Network. I wanted to work on it like as a kid, right? And I was hoping that at some point, I'd be, bumping into the great creators like Gendy Tartakovsky and Craig McCracken or whatever, and they'd personally teach me how to animate, and I'd be some sort of like kid prodigy and create like the greatest TV show on Cartoon Network or whatever. And I don't know, I had a lot of really lofty expectations for this project. I think the hardest thing about recollecting about it though is that I never wrote any of this stuff down, and I never told anybody about it. So it's like this weird thing where like I'm trying to like piece together this weirdly elaborate concept. So I've been like kind of beating around the bush about this whole thing. So what exactly is this thing? It is, at least what I called it was Dynamite Action Squad. And I'm sure a lot of you who are like big Cartoon Network heads are like confused. What are you talking about? That's already a thing that exists. And you're correct. So a while back, Cartoon Network used to have this block called Cartoon Fridays, where they'd show new cartoons, and they kind of like wrap it around the context of it being kind of like a big late night show. It used to be a thing where the cartoon characters themselves hosted it, then they had a live host and stuff, but then they kind of got, I don't want to say gutted it, but like, they canceled it and they replaced it with a different version, which was called Friday Dynamite, and it was like a bunch of these kids and stuff, and they were hosting it, and because it was different, everybody hated it. But I was different because I was like this massive Cartoon Network fan who loved everything that the network did, and I really loved Friday Dynamite. I mean, I didn't love it more than Cartoon Fridays, but like, I thought it was cool, right? And so they also had a sister block on Saturdays for Saturday action cartoons called Dynamite Action Squad, and they'd have these like little like couple second shorts of like this pretend superhero team going on like weird like action stuff or like action like missions or whatever. And I decided to use that as sort of like the building blocks for my concept, right? I decided to just ignore everything that happened in those shorts, just do my own thing, and I kind of made it my own weird universe with all these characters and stuff. So what exactly is Dynamite Action Squad? So the idea is that there's essentially like kind of like a composite like Cartoon Network world. All of these Cartoon Network shows exist in one world, right? And so because of that, all these characters are like interacting and clashing with each other and stuff. So it's essentially kind of like a Justice League show, but with Cartoon Network characters. And so the idea would be that like, this team of different characters from different shows would come together and they would fight bad guys and protect the world and all that jazz. The big gimmick was that the team was mostly comprised of characters from comedy shows, not action shows. So I should probably get down to like, the actual cast, right? The two leads were actually going to be original characters. They were based off of the two main hosts of Friday Dynamite. I wasn't really sure if they had any powers or anything. The only idea I had was that they had like these sort of like track suits on or whatever. and they kind of acted as sort of like the leaders of the team. There was also kind of another co-leader, and that was Ben Tennyson from Ben 10. At the time of me coming up with this concept, I think Alien Force was just coming out, so that was the version of Ben we were working with. And then the rest of the team comprised of Blue from Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends, Chowder from Chowder, Flapjack from The Marvelous Misadventures of Flapjack, Laszlo from Captain Laszlo, and then Schnitzel from Chowder as well. And so that was sort of the core team. And then the rest of the show was kind of functioned as sort of like a Batman Brave and the Bold sort of deal, where they would also kind of like partner up with other like action characters. So you'd have an episode where they, helped out Generator Rex or Secret Saturdays or Samurai Jack or the Powerpuff Girls or whatever, right? And like by proxy, the Rogues Gallery was mostly comprised of villain characters from other action shows. So like, Vilgax, Aku, Van Kleist from Generator Rex, that whole jazz, right? And so the whole idea was, you'd have like, Vilgax is doing something and then the team would go and stop him or whatever, and that'd be the whole deal. And so that was kind of the whole idea. The first season was just basically establishing the concepts, like the sort of general flow of different episodes and stuff. There'd be some random Cartoon Network villain, they'd be doing something, and then everybody would jump in and try and do something, and then as the seasons go on, we'd either add more shows, right, or we'd explore something about the world, right? So that was sort of the general idea, right? So my idea I had with the show was basically that I wanted to have a thing where, like, as because the thing was that this is a crossover show, right? So what I wanted to do as a kid was that, like, as shows would be added onto the channel, right, those shows would then be sort of absorbed into Dynamite Action Squad, so they'd be added to the universe, right? So yeah, that was kind of like the general kind of concept I had for the show. I think the weirdest thing about the concept, right, was basically how the universe worked, right? All of the weird world building stuff I had was actually kind of weirdly elaborate. I don't know. It's hard to describe, right? So despite the way I'm describing this, it isn't a multiverse, right? It isn't different separate realities. My idea was that like every single like show was like kind of like superimposed into a massive world, right? So any show that like would take place on quote unquote Earth was in this planet, and essentially any show that kind of like took place in like some sort of like simulacrum of like America or whatever was in like this whole like was in its own like continent or whatever, right? Like essentially like I was coming up with this idea around the time the sort of like the Cartoon Network City era was, and so that was kind of my like base plate for what I wanted the world to be like. So like the quote unquote Cartoon Network City was like kind of like the core area, and in the specific different areas, the different towns and stuff kind of like extended out. So like the city was kind of like the capital city, and then like different locations sort of branched out and stuff, So like you had the city, and then like I had this idea that like it was sort of like an extension of like Townsville, right? And then you had like different like sort of places, like you had the neighborhood that Ed and Eddie were in and stuff, and then like stuff like that. Like they kind of like the city was like the core of that world, and then different cities from different shows kind of like were connected to it and stuff. And that was sort of my idea. And my idea was like I said before, as shows got added to the channel, right, they would also by proxy be added to the universe. I guess another aspect of the universe that I should probably mention too that was also kind of weird about it was that all of the cartoon characters were also actors too. So I came up with this weird concept where like the only way I can describe it is that it's basically like really similar to like there's like a direct-to-DVD Garfield movie about like comic strip characters essentially being actors, right? So they would act out the comic strips, and then they would like kind of essentially appear live on newspapers, and that's kind of essentially how the show functioned, essentially, right? So essentially like I don't know. Adventure Time got added really late to like the concept of the show, but like essentially what it was like, I'm using this as an example, right? So let's say there's like a hypothetical episode where, like, you know, Ice King is stealing Princess Bubblegum and Finn and Jake have to stop him or whatever, right? So all those characters would essentially would be actors acting out that episode, and there would be like essentially animated versions of the Adventure Time crew existing in this world, who would essentially film that episode, right? I'm imagining like Pendleton Ward in like a director's chair or whatever, like he's like the director or whatever, right? And then essentially that footage would be streamed over to the real world. So that's the thing, right? So there was the Cartoon Network world, and then there was the real world, and then the real world would broadcast that show, right? I think the really dumb thing about this concept though was that despite, you know, the characters acting these shows out, there wasn't any really change in their roles or their personalities or whatever. Like, after that episode was done, like, Ice King would still try and capture princesses and stuff, right? There wasn't any difference between, you know, Ice King the actor and Ice King the character in Adventure Time or whatever, right? So, like, it was just kind of a weird concept I wasn't really sure how to make sense of. So that was one facet of the show. Another facet of the show was the concept of, you know, the composite multiverse or whatever that I was doing, right? So like I stated before, shows would be added to the universe as they'd show up in the channel, right? And my idea was that I was also doing something with the nudes. So if you watched Cartoon Network a long time ago, there was an era where they had all these characters essentially look like vinyl toys and stuff. They called them nudes, and I was really into them. I know a lot of people really hate them now, but I like them. I think they're really cool and they're really cute, and I wanted to do something with them in the show. So my idea was that weird void that they were in was essentially sort of like empty space for different universes, right? And the nudes themselves were essentially like blank slate characters. So every time a new show was being developed, these characters would be kind of pulled out of this void and be kind of like created into like the actual characters themselves. And then once the show is actually premiered on Cartoon Network, they kind of like pop into existence into this universe, right? And there was also another character that I had. There was like the big golden nude who was like a part of the You Are Here like action Friday action bumpers, action like block or whatever. And he was kind of like, I wouldn't call him like a king, the king of this world, but he's kind of like essentially like a cosmic janitor, right? He was kind of there to like fix any sort of like weird like time-space stuff that happened. So like if the universe ever got broken in half, he'd be the one to fix it, right? He was also kind of like someone who cataloged all of the shows. So all the story of all the shows got like in this big book of Cartoon Network or whatever, and he'd be the one like cataloging all of the information of all these shows and how all their stories ended and stuff. I think another big thing too was also exploring like the idea of this being a composite world, right? So like I said before, these weren't like separate universes. They were like they're all supposed to be existing on the same Earth, right? So that also meant that in the outer space, right? So essentially, anytime there's like any instance of there being other planets in other shows, those would be other planets in this solar system too. So any other planet that, you know, Ben visited in Alien Force or Ultimate Alien would be planets that would be in this solar system or whatever, right? There is, I should correct myself. There was a multiverse, but like, not in the way that you think. It was essentially like a binary multiverse, right? So I had this really dumb idea about the solar system of this world being like, essentially like the big solar system was kind of looked like, when you zoomed all the way out, it looked like the Cartoon Network logo. And the universe that it took place on was in the seaside, but then there was like a kind of like an Elseworld, like flip-flopped universe on the other side that took place on the end version, which was like the negative universe, right? And the big difference between that one was that all the good guys were bad guys and all the bad guys were good guys. So like, I don't know, I had this one story about like Finn and Jake being like these weird like fascist like cops or whatever, right? And they're like capturing all these guys, and so the team had to team up with like a good version of Vilgax to kind of stop them and get back. I also had this idea about like the null void being like in between these two other universes. So that was kind of like the core idea I had with this universe, right? Like all these universes are kind of like congealing together and stuff. So I should probably break down what the seasons would be like. As a kid, I had this idea of like the show essentially like going on forever, but like I had essentially three seasons worth of stories to explore, right? So we had season 1, which was essentially the introduction to everything. It was the characters kind of trying to establish themselves. You know, they go into the big city and they create their big superhero base, and they try to figure out their powers and stuff, and try and like, you know, figure out and like make relationships and stuff. So I had this idea for like a big like 2-parter series premiere thing where you get to see the teams kind of meet up with each other. I had this idea about the 2 original characters like coming from like some sort of weird orphanage, and they wanted to go into the big city and be heroes or whatever. So they had to escape because like the lady running the orphanage was like this big like mean person or whatever, and it was like in like the outskirts of the desert or whatever. I had this idea about like the middle of nowhere from Courage the Cowardly Dog being like this massive desert that was like on the outskirts of the Cartoon Network city. So they're kind of escaping. They're escaping this orphanage, right? And they're gonna go into the big city and be heroes, or right? Be superheroes or whatever. I had this other running storyline that would have been set up in this big premiere where Tom from Toonami, he was another one of those characters. He also facilitated the broadcast of TV shows and stuff from like the Absolution, the big spaceship he had. So one of the running stories I had was that like the spaceship crash lands on Earth and lands in the desert, and so like Tom for the majority of season 1 is actually out of commission, and so his like AI buddy Sarah ends up kind of helping the team out, and she becomes kind of like their AI that they get like crime alerts from or whatever. So they end up rescuing Tom, who's kind of like in a coma or whatever, right? And so they end up like bumping into all these other characters, and there's I don't remember, like, see, that's the problem with me like not writing any of this stuff down, because like I probably had like specific ideas for episodes, but I don't remember specific episodes, right? But I don't know, essentially the idea is that there's some sort of big problem happening, some sort of like big villain or whatever, and so they're like kind of trying to develop a superhero team or whatever. They get Ben's help. They're trying to figure out like other people to join the team or whatever, and they kind of only get left with like Blue, Flapjack, Chowder, and Laszlo. I had this idea for Schnitzel, where like it was kind of like that one Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy episode of SpongeBob, where like Mr. Crab forces Squidward to be on the superhero team, and that's kind of the situation that they have with like Mung Dollars. Like he tells Schnitzel he has to like join the team so that like Chowder doesn't get killed or whatever. So that was the reason why Schnitzel was on the team. Another big thing, a part of this premiere, was that that was another gimmick that I had with the show, right? Because most of the team are comprised of like comedy characters, they didn't know how to fight, right? So one of the things that they did was they created weapons for all the characters, right? So like I said before, I don't really remember a whole lot about what I was doing with the 2 original leads. Ben obviously has the Omnitrix. So I'm going to try my best to try and remember everything. So Blue had a Viking helmet, and when he pressed it, he turned into his blue super dude persona. So he was like this big muscly dude, and he had a giant axe and a bare hand or whatever. And that was his thing, right? Chowder got a new hat that like could like transform into like weapons and stuff. One of the things it mostly did was that it turned into like those does anyone remember like TKO, that like browser fighting game that they had where all the characters were like big robots? Essentially Chowder turned into one of those when he pressed the button on his hat, but it could also transform into other stuff. Flapjack's thing was actually really hard to remember. I think I basically just made him like a Super Saiyan, right? Like he glowed yellow, he could shoot laser beams, he could like fly and had super strength or whatever. It's really silly, right? There's no change in his design. He just had like a glowing aura around him all the time. I don't remember if Laszlo had anything, which is funny. I think I had this idea about him just being kind of athletic because he's like a monkey or whatever. That's not even the stupidest one though. I had this really stupid idea for Schnitzel, right? So Schnitzel didn't have any powers either because he was just already strong, right? So he was already super strong. But I had this really dumb idea about, like I think at some point during the premiere they meet up with like Kevin, right? And he gives Schnitzel one of those like plumber badges. that like lets him translate his voice. So instead of saying rada rada all the time, he like spoke actual English, and that was his gimmick for the show, right? Which was really dumb, right? Because the whole thing with that is basically like Chewbacca, right? Where like no matter what he says, everybody understands him, right? So like so like it's really dumb that like I decided, because I was like, you remember that one episode of Chowder, right? Where like they get like that like weird dial and they changed Truffle's voice, right? And then they had that one gag where like Schnitzel uses the dial and he like talks regularly, right? Like I really latched onto that joke and I wanted to do something with it. So now he just like he talks normally now. I think sometimes he goes back to like erase the regular like rada rada voice, but like he would just talk normally, and like he just had an Omnitrix symbol on his chest. And he just talked like a normal person, and it was really dumb. But yeah, that was the whole deal, right? And so that stuff would be established in season 1, and so you'd have a whole bunch of different running storylines. Vilgax would be doing stuff, and everybody would have to stop him. They'd be continually trying to like revive Tom, so he could be a part of the team or whatever. And those were kind of like the running storylines. I was thinking up of stuff for like season 2. Season 2, I don't remember whether or not I was conceiving season 2 during the start of Omniverse or the middle of Ultimate Alien, but my idea was that at this point there would be like kind of like a big update to the universe and certain shows would be added. So like Symbionic Titan was a big one, so they'd essentially be a part of the team. And then certain characters that were kind of just like guest stars in season 1 became like permanent members in season 2. So like the Powerpuff Girls, I had planned to be kind of like people who would like pop in and out of stories, but they wouldn't be like reoccurring characters. But in season 2, they kind of like essentially joined the team. Same thing with like Ed and Eddie. Like I had them as kind of like guest members, right? And then they actually would show up. They actually become like full members of the team. Also, there's other new shows like Regular Show and Adventure Time. They would also kind of be a part of the universe as well. And so yeah, the idea is that certain characters who had updates in their shows would be updated, and then certain shows that got added to the channel would be updated and they'd be part of the team. The third story I had for the season 3, or at least the third story arc I had, was this idea that involved Reanimated and Out of Jimmy's Head. I had this concept where I was kind of like reworking the lore of that show and that movie into this show, right? And I had this idea that like Jimmy's world was like the real world, right? And like the cartoonist that he got the brain of was kind of like an ex like Hanna-Barbera animator, right? So I was kind of like redacting I was like redacting like the weird stuff, and I made like all of those cartoon characters in that movie essentially like redacted like Hanna-Barbera characters. So when that show came out, like they got re-added in, and so my idea was that like Jimmy would be a character who could like go in and out of the Cartoon Network world and the real world. So when he joined the Cartoon Network world, he was like animated and stuff, but then and then when he went back to the real world, it was live action. And so I had this idea about him like jumping in and out, and him constantly jumping between worlds was like opening like portals for like villains to go into the real world. And so the big, I guess, quote-unquote finale was like every single character in Cartoon Network history coming into the real world and stopping some big like villain or whatever. And that was kind of the general breakdown, I think. Of course, I'd probably be able to say more if I could remember any of this stuff, or like, you know, if I could remember any of this stuff, or like any like even wrote any of this stuff down. But I was kind of like the basic breakdown of like this weird like TV show pitch I had. I had no understanding of how animation worked as a kid, so I literally thought if I just wrote down a notebook full of these ideas and like mailed it to like the Cartoon Network like studios building, that they would just like let me make a TV show in like a week or whatever. So like that was my idea, and I actually kind of like walked around and bragged about it as a kid. I was like, oh man, like in a week's time you're gonna see my TV show, you're gonna see my drawings on TV or whatever. And like I mean, and like at the same time, like I think I was like the only person in my class that cared about cartoons. So like I don't think anyone really took me seriously, but I don't think they actually like knew anything about cartoons either. So I don't know if they didn't like not believe me, they just didn't care. There are a few like really weird stories I have attached to this concept. There were some other stories, so there was a couple instances where I had like weird mental breakdowns about the longevity of this concept. I remember very distinctly there was one New Year's Eve. So I guess I should probably set the stage right. So normally what I do for New Year's Eve is that like we like go to our church, and we're there until like 12 o'clock or whatever. But a while back we used to do this thing where like a couple of my family friends would like get together, and we'd have like fellowship and stuff at our house, right? And because I was the oldest kid, I would take care of all the other kids of the other like parents' kids or whatever, and we'd all just go to our basement and watch TV and play with toys or whatever. So it was kind of that deal with like New Year's Eve or whatever. And I remember everybody was getting ready to leave when I was on the computer, and one of the things I usually did back then was go on cartoonnetwork.com. I was there when the clock struck 12, and the site updated, and it updated with an ad for Cartoon Network Fusion Fall. And that was the first time I ever heard of the game. And when I saw it, I freaked out. Like I freaked out like in two separate ways, right? Because on one hand I was excited, right? Because it's a cool action, Cartoon Network crossover game. That's like the coolest thing ever. At the same time, I also freaked out because I thought this completely cannibalized my entire concept. I'm like, how am I going to pitch this show when they're already creating a project that's essentially what I'm doing, right? I got over it pretty quickly because I was excited about the game. One of the things I actually ended up doing was kind of incorporating Fusion Fall stuff. So I guess one of the things I never explained was that it wasn't just a composite world, but it was also a composite multiverse too. So separate different universes were also comprising this world. I think if like I had continued with this concept early on, Fiona and Cake would probably be characters in this show, and they'd probably be like characters and stuff. But like, yeah. So essentially, what I ended up doing was that like Fusion Fall was like essentially another continent on this planet, which in proxy doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But yeah, that's the idea. So like in this world, there are two separate Dexters, but they just look different. It's very silly. The same thing happened again with Adventure Time, but it wasn't for this TV show. I actually had another original concept that I was coming up with as a kid. Essentially, I had this idea about writing a story about a kid who goes to an island of living toys, and I had this idea for a character who was kind of like a sock monkey, but instead of being a monkey, he's like a jester. And I swear to you, he looked exactly like Finn. But like before, when I was coming up with the concept for the character, I never watched any like Adventure Time promos. I never watched the What a Cartoon pilot. I didn't know what Adventure Time was. So when I saw those very first promos for Adventure Time, I also freaked out too, because it's like, I was like, I came up with this character and he looks exactly like Finn. And I was like freaking out because it's like, I can't pitch this show, right? They already have a character that looks like one of my characters, right? Once again, I ended up getting over it, but it did like mean that I kind of stopped developing that character because I retroactively changed him to not look like Finn, but then I stopped liking him. So yeah, those are kind of some weird stories attached to that. I think my favorite story attached to this weird concept has to do with one that led to the actual development of an actual OC that I'm using. So I'm not sure if your schools did this, but my school had a project where we got to write our own books, and we had these like blank books that had like blank covers and blank pages, so you could write and draw on the covers and stuff, and they told us we had to come up with stories. So as a kid, like for the longest time in elementary school, I was the artist kid, right? So I felt like I had this I had this almost like sort of like responsibility to like be like have the most crazy creative story, right? And so I had this idea of like, what if I turned one of my hypothetical episodes into the story I would turn into for this project, right? This is a weird idea, right? But like one of my ideas was like, essentially what I was going to do was I was going to write my story about a hypothetical season 2 opener where they're telling like a story about how Blue creates the Blue Super Dude helmet. I think the weird thing about that though is that like my idea was that he would get the helmet in the season 1 premiere, so I don't understand why I was writing a hypothetical season 2 premiere where they're telling a story about that when we already would have seen it. It's a whole thing. It probably didn't make sense back then either. So essentially what I was essentially writing for what I was going to turn into my school project was essentially a season 2 premiere for a crossover Cartoon Network, a hypothetical crossover Cartoon Network show that, 1, I never wrote anything down about it, 2, I never told anybody, and here's the big kicker, right? I was handing this in to my teacher, right? And this teacher is an adult who has no idea or has never watched any Cartoon Network show. So I write down this entire story, right? I hand it to the teacher, and she reads this and is like, this is literal nonsense. I have no idea what on earth this stuff is, right? And I was so offended, right? I was like, oh, this person is a Philistine. They don't know anything about art. And I was so upset. And I was like, because it was a totally a pride thing, right? Because it's like, everybody was always like, I remember as a kid, everybody hated this project because they were like, I can't draw. I can only draw a stick figure. I can't come up with a story. And I was like, oh, this is going to be easy. I can do all this stuff. I could write a story in my sleep. So then when I came up with the story, I was like, I thought it was going to be like the coolest thing ever and everyone was going to love it, right? And then obviously the teacher wouldn't understand any of this stuff, right? Because he doesn't watch cartoons, right? And also, I never told anybody or wrote any of this stuff down. And this is going to be a hypothetical season 2 in my 4-season project, right? So, it makes sense that she doesn't understand anything that I wrote down. So I got really upset and I started coming up with this fake pretend story because it's like, oh, she just wants me to write some dumb story about some kid who goes to the park or whatever. But I realized that making a weird story out of spite would be kind of lame. So I decided to try and rework the story into something original and coherent. So instead of the blue super dude from Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends, I came up with a superhero called the Indigo Blue Super Dude. And he was essentially kind of like Green Lantern, except he's blue, right? And that was kind of the general story. I actually still have the book, but it's probably in my box full of stuff, and I probably don't have it right now. But that was the general story, and looking back at it, I was pretty happy with it. So a couple of years, a whole bunch of years passed by, right? And I'm coming up with this concept for a webcomic that's comprised of characters that don't have any stories, right? OCs that I just made that didn't have any stories attached to them. And so I'm thinking of characters that has oh, hey, what about the Indigo Blue Super Dude, right? So I rework him and he's this private eye detective guy who he's made out of shadow or whatever, and he becomes Indigo Dynamo, and he's an OC who's going to be in a story someday in the future. So that's cool. So I guess that kind of amounted, this whole weird fan fiction thing amounted to something. Yeah, so obviously by the fact that I'm just recollecting about this thing as a thing of the past, right? It's obviously not something that I'm trying to do, continuing doing, right? So I guess I'm not really sure really what changed, right? I think probably what changed was me growing as a consumer of media, right? As a kid, I really just liked anything animated, right? I didn't really care about the quality. I didn't really have taste, right? I just liked animated stuff, right? My favorite TV show changed by a weekly basis, right? But after Adventure Time came out, right, and I started watching that, a lot of what I wanted to do really changed, right? I think a lot of that kind of had to do with the fact that I was recognizing creators, right? And trying to figure out what their creative ideas were and what inspired them and stuff, right? And I was looking at these TV shows on a deeper artistic level, right? And so I started to become more invested in creating my own stuff rather than just trying to take advantage or take credit for stuff that other people made, right? I obviously still drew fan art and stuff, but I didn't have any interest in drawing stories about other stuff, right? I was starting to try and come up with my own original ideas. And I just became more invested in just, doing my own thing and creating my own stories that could stand toe to toe with these other stories that inspired me. Yeah, and I don't know. I think it's kind of cool that I've kind of come full circle, right? And now I'm writing stories. I'm writing stories about other characters again, but it's with a different perspective. So I guess I did kind of grow from that. It would be kind of fascinating to, like, you know, go back in time and show my younger me what I'm making now. But yeah, that's kind of the weird story of the weird, very awful fan fiction that I made as a kid. Yeah.